Hello and welcome to Mr. C History. Now today I am on an odyssey to discover and find out more about a real hero of mine, a person who I think is one of the most significant literary figures of the 20th century, a man who's buried here, Eric Arthur Blair, or as the world knew him, George Orwell. Now he had a very varied and interesting but quite tragic and short life, which is what we're going to look at and find out a bit more. I also want to have a look at his legacy, his impact, and of course we'll look at his literary work, but just find out who this man was and why he is so significant. Eric Arthur Blair was born in 1903 in India, in the state of Bihar, or Bengal as it was then. His father, Richard, worked in the opium department of the Indian civil service. Now, many years later, Orwell would say that his family were in the lower, upper, middle class, whatever that means. But I think what it means is sort of socially and culturally respectable, high up, but financially constrained. Now, Orwell seemed to really dislike the class system, but at the same time, he seemed to be pretty obsessed with it. Anyway, when he was very young, a plague breaks out in Bengal and his French mother Ida decides to take him and his sister back to the Thames Valley, to Shiplake, and enrolls him in a prep school called St. Cyprian's. Now, years later, Orwell would write an essay called Such Were the Joys, and he would describe the prep school as a fascist organisation, a place of bullying, a place of snobbery, a place where punishments were meted out for just wetting the bed. He really did hate his time at the prep school, and it seemed to have a profound impact on him. Eventually, however, he got a scholarship, the King's Scholarship, to Eton College, an extraordinarily prestigious school and prestigious scholarship to get. And he seemed a little bit happier here. He liked the intellectual freedom he got here. He actually was a bit of a japester, a bit of a sort of rebel, as it were. And indeed, he was taught here by Aldous Huxley, who would go on to write Brave New World, another dystopian novel often compared to 1984. He didn't like the elitism of Eton, so when he left, he had a big decision to make. This is the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which during Orwell's lifetime is where the British Empire was run from. And this is a good place to talk about what Orwell did next after leaving Eton. Now, unlike many of his contemporaries at Eton, Orwell did not go to university. Why? Well, the official reason given is that his family couldn't afford to send him. That's probably true, and his academic record was mixed, so he probably wasn't going to get a scholarship. But I also think, and one common theme that's going to come up with Orwell throughout all of this, is his rebelliousness. I think because other people were doing it, he decides to go against that, and that is a common theme that's going to come up quite a lot. So what Orwell decides to do then is to sign up to the Indian Imperial Army, and he heads to Burma to become a policeman. He spends 5 years in Burma and he absolutely hates it, and he learns to totally despise the British Empire and the imperial system. He wrote 2 very searing essays on this. One's called A Hanging, where he witnesses a man having to be hanged, and he says he describes it as worse than 1,000 murders. And a really famous essay is Shooting of an Elephant, where a baying mob of 1,000 locals demand that he, the white man, the imperial symbol, the man representing the British Empire, shoots an elephant they've taken some sort of umbrage with. Orwell describes the British Empire as evil and the imperial system as evil, and he soon realises the British Empire is only held up by fear, by racism, and by violence, and by the threat of violence. And for the rest of his life, he rails against imperialism. Very, very progressive stuff. All quite interesting as well, because he is a son of the empire. He's born in India. His father was in the opium trade for China. His mother was part of the teak trade as well. And he's had ancestors who had owned plantations in the Caribbean. So he is a son of empire. Perhaps that's what it is. He's rebelling against his own past. This, of course, is Trafalgar Square. And George Orwell spent a bit of time here when he was homeless. The period between 1928 and 1931 was a time when he explored homelessness, and it all culminated in a very famous book, Down and Out in Paris and London. It started in 1928 when he went to Paris. He'd resigned from the Indian Imperial police force and had declared to his parents that he wants to become a writer. So off he went to Paris, where Hemingway and Joyce already were expatriates, and he perhaps envisaged a bohemian lifestyle as a writer in Paris. But it didn't go very well. He fell ill and all his money was stolen from him and he was forced out onto the street. He took up a job as a plongeur, or a dishwasher, dirty, grimy, unpleasant work, and had to live from subsistence to subsistence, looking for his own meals from doss house to doss house. He then came back to Britain, hang out in places like Trafalgar Square with other down and outs, his words, going from workhouse to doss house, places like that, living on the streets. Now, why? Well, as I say, it sort of started off that, but why did he carry this on? And he carried it on for about 3 years. Well, I think part of it was rebellion. We've already talked a lot about Orwell's rebellious streak. He perhaps rebelling against his privilege. He also was striving for authenticity. He believed to be able to write about these people, he should experience their life. Method writing, actually being a homeless person. Before he can write about homelessness, he needs to be a homeless person. And so when Down and Out in Paris and London was published, it had stories of these people, ex-soldiers from World War I who are now down and out, petty criminals, people of the street, all about their slang, their lifestyle, and things like that. But it also portrayed them with dignity, and it showed that perhaps it was the system that was wrong, not necessarily them, and Orwell learnt an awful lot from his experience. After publishing Down and Out, Orwell managed to pick himself up and got a little bit of money and managed to get himself a job here in South End Green, specifically at a bookshop was at that corner there. It was known as Book Lovers Corner and he lived in the flat above. It was here as well that he changed his name, or more specifically created his nom de plume, his writing name. He didn't want to publish Down and Out in Paris and London under his real name, Eric Arthur Blair, because he was worried it might embarrass his family. So he made up a new name, George, good English name, the same name as the King, and Orwell, a river in Suffolk where his parents had moved to. And it was here where he did some of his most prolific writing. He wrote Burmese Days and Keep the Aspidistra Flying, books there. He wrote lots of his essays, including one about working in a bookshop where he just complained, as always with Orwell, about the customers and the smell of old books. And it was also here that he was given a commission to go up to the north of England to look at the lives of the working class people in the north. And this became the book, The Road to Wigan Pier. In the first part of the book, he describes the awful conditions that many people have to live in places like Wigan, Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds, etc. in the north. And the second half of the book is a bit of a rant, a bit of a polemic by him, saying, you know, it's awful that these people live in this. We've had 150 years of progress in Britain and this is all the working classes have to show for it, those who've done all the work. And I think this is where he was at his most socialist as well. I've come here to the Marxist reading room in Islington to discuss Orwell's politics, his ideology, and answer that key question that many people have. Was he a socialist or was he a conservative? Because nowadays those who are on the left and the right politically often use Orwell and quote Orwell to push their point. For example, those on the left look at The Road to Wigan Pier and Down and Out and discuss his ideas of championing the working classes. And those on the right talk about the searing anti-communism of Animal Farm and 1984, and indeed the CIA during the Cold War dropped copies of those books on occupied communist Eastern Europe. So where did Orwell lie? Well, I think it's fair to say he was confused, and indeed Kingsley Amis described him as an auto-contrarian in that he often disagreed with himself. But I think it's true, in his younger days he was definitely a fervent socialist, often championing the working classes. He was very anti-establishment, going back to his Eton days, of course really anti-imperialist, anti-British Empire. He also despised inequality, and his view was often based on fairness, wanting to create a fairer society, and that's what his view of socialism was. But at the same time, he also held some very conservative views, quite conservative views on gender roles, with the look of the way he treated Eileen. He also did believe in self-reliance a lot, a strong conservative belief. He was also very critical of middle-class socialists. He called them fruit juice drinking, sandal-wearing lefties. And indeed, he was fiercely patriotic. He firmly believed in his Englishness and the belief and love for England, describing England as the nation of flower lovers and pigeon fanciers, deeply patriotic. So hard to tell. I think one consistency though is his belief in democracy. I think if you're going to put a label on him, you can say he was a true and ardent Democrat. In 1935, George Orwell met a young woman, Eileen O'Shaughnessy, and they fell in love and they got married. And quickly soon they realised that the pollution of London and the business and the grime wasn't great for them, so they decided to move here to the village of Wallington in Hertfordshire, a real idyllic, rural, beautiful spot. Specifically, they moved to this house, which is still standing. And here they had a domestic, quite agrarian, quite sort of basic life. No central heating in there, outside toilets, that sort of thing, quite cold. But they seemed to love it. They ran a little shop, a grocery shop out of the front, selling a few groceries, and they ran all the animals, etc., milking goats. George Orwell famously wrote an essay about how to milk a goat. In reality, I think Eileen had to do most of the work. George Orwell would sit in the top, I think somewhere on the top floor there, writing all the time, writing his essays, coming up for air, the novel was written there. Eileen was the one who had to do all the husbandry of the animals, had to run the shop, also had to support him, I think a lot, all of his correspondence. And indeed in recent years, a recent biography of Eileen came out saying actually she helped him an awful lot with the writing and the inspiration. She wrote a poem about the year 1984, for example, and many of the experiences of Animal Farm were taken a lot from her. And there's a modern historian who would actually say that Eileen should be credited as a co-writer for some of Orwell's books. But I think maybe what is true is that I think George Orwell definitely loved Eileen, but was very reliant on him, stroke perhaps a bit demanding. It is true to say maybe that this was a happy time for George Orwell, but despite that, he still gets his itchy feet, and within a few months really of moving here, he is off again. Orwell left that rural idyll for Spain, specifically to fight in the Spanish Civil War. Now, the Spanish Civil War was fought between the nationalists and the Republicans. The nationalists were a group of right-wing rebels led by General Franco and supported by Nazi Germany. They were the fascists. The Republicans, who Orwell went to fight with, they were a ragtag sort of unification of different socialist and communist and even anarchist groups. And Orwell went to join one specific one of those groups, the POUM, P-O-U-M, which stands for Partido Obrera de Unificación Marxista, or the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification. When he got there in 1936, actually things were incredibly boring. The descriptions he came about were just him sitting in muddy trenches, not doing much, not firing any weapons. So he was becoming quite disillusioned. The disillusionment continues even further when the Republicans, the Socialists and the Communists start fighting with each other. And actually that's because I'm not quite at the right memorial here. This is the memorial to the International Brigades in Jubilee Gardens under the shadow of the London Eye. The POUM, the group that which Orwell was part of, were not actually part of the International Brigades because the International Brigades were supported and supplied and given money by the Soviet Union. POUM were very separate. Not only were they anti-fascist, they were also very specifically anti-Soviet, anti-Stalinist, which meant that there was friction, tension amongst them. There were communists who supported Stalin and the Soviet Union in the International Brigade and those who were dead against him, which meant that soon Orwell was actually being fired upon and being hounded out of Spain by his fellow communists. Things get worse for George Orwell by the spring of 1937 when he's in his trench, he pops his head over the parapet and he gets shot in the throat by a sniper, and the bullet goes straight through and misses the main artery by just millimeters. He was very lucky to survive, but his civil war is over. So he comes back from Spain injured, weakened, and his faith in socialism and communism brutally also impacted. This is Broadcasting House, the BBC, and in between the years of 1941 and 1943, George Orwell worked here. Indeed, there's actually quite a rakish statue of him just sort of hidden in a tunnel beyond there. He worked in the eastern section, essentially creating propaganda or cultural sort of propaganda to counter a lot of the fascist propaganda, specifically aimed at India and Southeast Asia. George was actually quite disillusioned by his time here at the BBC. He described it as a cross between a girls' boarding school and a lunatic asylum, and he described the work he did there as useless. I don't think he liked creating all this propaganda. He also didn't like all the censorship. Everything he wrote was triple checked, etc. And he described it all as half-truths. Some of the things he was saying he didn't ultimately believe. And actually he got quite a bit of inspiration for the Ministry of Truth in 1984 from the BBC. But World War II was actually a very, very busy time for Orwell. Not only was he working here at the BBC, he was also writing furiously. He couldn't fight because of the injury he had from Spain, but he said that the pen was his weapon, and he wrote lots of essays and books and pamphlets and things like that. Indeed, he wrote a famous essay called The Lion and the Unicorn, essentially calling for a democratic, socialist, English revolution, push away the royal family and the normal aspects of British life to fight the fascists, fight the Nazis. Despite all this, Orwell was very pro-war and was very keen for it all to be fought and was very anti-fascist, anti-Hitler. And he really railed against pacifism. Something else that kept him very busy was his volunteering with the Home Guard, Dad's army. He got fully involved in training many of the Home Guard in how to fight. Now, many of the people who were training the Home Guard were crusty old generals from the First World War, giving them lectures on the Battle of Waterloo, etc. George Orwell actually had good experience of guerrilla warfare, hand-on-hand fighting, sniping, etc. from Spain. So he's very, very useful. Indeed, his wife would say that he would come home sometimes covered in mud and exhausted from very enthusiastic training. But the Home Guard too is something that Orwell got very frustrated in. He wanted them to be more radical. He wanted the Home Guard to become a militia of millions of men who would lead this English revolution that he was talking about. He famously says, "The rifle that hangs on the working class flat is the symbol of democracy. It is our job to keep it there." He wanted to make sure that after the Second World War, the working class people of Britain could rise up and could lead their revolution. Stirring stuff. Now, in 1946, George Orwell wrote an essay called The Moon Underwater about the perfect English pub. And this is the Compton Arms in Islington, which is said to be one of the main pubs that was the inspiration for that pub. The Moon Underwater is fictional, but maybe this is the one he based it on. He did just live around the corner where he wrote Animal Farm in Canonbury Square, and it does meet some of the descriptions that he said for a perfect pub. One of them is to be down a quiet side street so none of the drunken rabble on the main roads come in. One is to have a small garden, Victorian architecture inside, serving good English ale in pewter mugs. He also said there should be motherly barmaids. I don't know if they're there now. He also wanted to make sure there was no radio and they were very quiet places, and it is still very quiet today. Other random stuff though, he insisted that they should sell liver sausage. This speaks of George Orwell's love for all things English, and he put pubs right up there with that community spirit. Interestingly, the founder of Wetherspoons, Tim Martin, has taken this very much to heart, and a lot of Wetherspoons pub have the word moon in it, and indeed 13 of the Wetherspoons pubs are called the Moon Underwater, so there are moons underwater now. I'm not sure they're quite what Orwell envisaged. Eventually, all this commuting into London got too much for the Orwells, so they moved here to 28B Canterbury Square in Islington. Also, they had adopted a son, Richard. He had just arrived 3 weeks old. They're now a family unit, so they've moved here. Probably not the best places to be in an unheated, unclean, sort of animal-ridden place in the countryside. Orwell was also in the midst of writing one of his most famous books, Animal Farm. He'd actually got the inspiration from that whilst in the countryside at Wallington. He'd seen a young boy whipping a big cart horse, and he just thought, what happens if the horse himself turned on the little boy with a bit of a kick? What if the animals turned on the tyrannical owners? And that is the story of Animal Farm. The animals of the farm turn against the farmer and they try and build their own equal society. But of course, the pigs rule supreme, and some are more equal than others, and it's pigs who are elevated to the same level as the humans in the end. It was an allegory, a political allegory, specifically and obviously against the Soviet Union, totalitarianism of communism, of Stalinist communism. And this is why actually Orwell struggled to get the Animal Farm published at first, because this is during the Second World War, nearing the end of it, where Soviet Union and Stalin was Britain's ally, helping to defeat the Nazis. So many publishers didn't want to see a criticism of the Soviet Union. But it was eventually published, and it was a huge success. It suddenly now elevated him in terms of fame and in terms of wealth. So, all very good, happy families, and now success. But in the middle of all of this, horrendous tragedy strikes. Eileen goes in for some routine surgery and unfortunately dies of cardiac upset during anaesthetic. Orwell is totally shocked, totally crestfallen. He described it as a ton of bricks being put upon him. And so he ingratiates himself even more into work, writing essays and crucially starting his most significant book. This is Senate House, which during the Second World War was the location of the Ministry for Information, the very place that was providing the propaganda that Orwell were then put through on the BBC. And it is said that this inspired the Ministry of Truth in Orwell's significant book 1984. Now, Orwell didn't write 1984 in London. In fact, he wrote it on the small, rugged, isolated Scottish island of Jura. He apparently wanted to get away from it all and close himself off. And this was a time where his wife just died, the darkness of winter. It is a very dark and sombre book. The story is of course set in the future in 1984 and revolves around a man called Winston Smith trying to fight against the system that is surveilling him all the time, always watching him. Big Brother is watching him. It is a book that is a warning about totalitarianism. It is meant to represent a Britain that has been taken over by a totalitarian state. It's also a book that's had a really enduring legacy, timeless really, this fear of totalitarianism. And it is often considered one of the most important and significant books of the 20th century. Even in recent years, at a time of alternative facts and rising dictatorships and authoritarianism, it's still very important. In fact, in the past 2 years, the sales of 1984 have increased by 9,500%. It is still a book that is important and is shocking. It was also quite clearly a book that is being written by a dying man. Now, by 1949, George Orwell was extremely ill. In fact, he'd been very ill since 1947. All through his time of writing 1984, he was ill with tuberculosis, TB. Now, how had he got TB? Well, he actually probably got it during his time when he was homeless, down and out in Paris and London in the late 1920s. But in reality, it was a combination of lots of factors which had made it much, much worse by 1949. As a child, he struggled really badly with chest infections, so his lungs were very weak. He'd been a lifelong, very heavy smoker, which certainly didn't help. Being shot in the throat in Spain, that definitely didn't help. He also had a pathological hatred for central heating, which was probably a terrible idea with somebody with bad lungs. And then also deciding to spend a lot of time in a cold, damp cabin on a Scottish island is not going to help the situation at all. And by the middle of 1949, he's holed up here at University College Hospital in a hospital bed. Extraordinarily, in the October of 1949, he actually gets married again to a woman called Sonia Brownwell. I think since the death of Eileen, he had been seeking companionship, and in fact, he'd proposed to people left, right and centre, and he finally found a woman who said yes. And the ceremony actually took place at his hospital bed, which is extraordinary. But the writing was on the wall, and on the 21st of January 1950, George Orwell died in a room just up there. Finally succumbed to the disease that plagued him for so long, tuberculosis. He was only 46 years old. And he was buried here in Sutton Courtenay, not far from Oxford. Why here? Because he didn't have any connections with this area. Well, actually, it was his friend David Astor, who was editor of The Observer and who was actually buried behind him there. He owned land here and managed to secure the spot. Now, this is a quaint English countryside church yard and cemetery, something that Orwell would have been very pleased about with his pride of Englishness and many of the things that he wrote about. And this is a good place to end and to discuss his significance and why I think he is so important. There's several things I admire about Orwell. I think he was ahead of his time. I think he had this amazing independent voice, never quite able to say, am I to the right or to the left? That putting pride in that sort of independent streak, I really admire. I think he was quite a lost soul, actually. He seemed to be quite, maybe some people might say he was grumpy, but or acerbic, but actually I think he was struggling with great ideas and was able to, couldn't perhaps articulate them through his personal life, but put them onto the written page so unbelievably well. And the other thing I think, and this really talks about why he's still so pertinent and powerful and resonates so much today, is he is a voice from the past, a warning from the past, a warning against totalitarianism, against over-authoritarianism, against bad regimes and defense of democracy. Because even now, all these things we hold dear, our freedoms, our liberties, our rights, they could become under threat. We should not take them for granted. And it is Orwell's voice that really, I think, helps to protect that. Anyway, I've gone on far too long. A great man, and I hope you've enjoyed his story. Please let me know what you think. Please don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you on the next one.